I'm just going to speak this afternoon about a particular project, which is this project called Ecological Urbanism. It already exists as a book and as an ebook and as an app. So there are lots of ways in which, if you're interested, you can engage with this particular project, but it goes back a few years, and it really comes out of the need for us in the context of the academy to develop certain modes, certain methods of understanding and responding to the making of our cities that really transcend certain notions or historic notions of what planning and what urban design is. So on the one hand, it's seen as a specific mode of addressing cities through the lens of ecology, and on the other hand, it's seen as a way of constructing a new discourse in some ways. So those are, it's kind of two aspirations. There are lots of other things. This is now published as a book by Lars Muller, and I just wanted to obviously take a few minutes to just give you the kind of historic context for this work. This is really showing you a diagram of Rome, and one of the things that I think is interesting to know, the formation of the 16th century city, how cities were evolving. A lot of interest, actually, in terms of the formation of cities, came from the idea of understanding how practicing on the territory, practicing on land, dealing with landscape, became an important testing ground for the formation of the kind of imagination that would then make it possible for people to really think about the concept of planning or designing something beyond the sort of the scale of the local in some way. Because if you think about the historic city, a lot of people think about the medieval city, and really in terms of the medieval city, there is a spatial construct, but you also don't see the idea of a master plan, if you like, or a plan for the realization. So it's really during this Baroque period that you have this possibility of a kind of spatial imagination. And this city of Rome was designed for a short period of time between 1585 and 1590 by a particular pope called Sixtus V, who was experimenting with the making of his own garden, a villa that was called Villa Montalto, and really used the ideas from that villa to the making of the city. So I'm just using this to tell you that there's a very long history of the connection between the understanding of landscape on one level and the concept of the formation of cities. This, of course, is also reflected in the French context later on, where we see that there is a direct correlation between the way in which the French thought about the making of the landscape garden and, for example, the making of a city like Paris, which in one sense is based on the role and importance of defense, but on the other hand, really, in a similar fashion with the concepts of rond-points, central areas, and so on and so forth, how you would be able to transfer one mode of thought to another kind of context. Some of these ideas led to a certain project called landscape urbanism, but I realized maybe a few years later that this particular project, the project of thinking more specifically through the lens of landscape, also had certain limitations, because it was really focusing specifically on the transference of methods from landscape to urbanization, and probably it would be beneficial, given the kind of complexities of urban conditions that we face today, to really think through a broader lens, to not just limit ourselves. And so the project of ecological urbanism became a project which is also a kind of strategy, it's a kind of sensibility, and this sensibility requires the phenomenon of anticipation, it requires collaboration, it talks about the senses, it talks about the concept of curation, how do we produce food, how do we produce the context for our cities, what is collaboration, and you see the word collaboration in some ways repeating, because collaboration becomes the basis for the mode of working, the mode of creating the specific context, interaction, mobility and mobilization, the measurement, how do we evaluate the success of our cities, how do we deal with concepts of adaptability and adaptation, and notions of incubation. So in a way, the kind of the literary phenomenon, or the words, what words we use to actually help us create certain kinds of processes or certain kinds of actions also became an important part of this. So these are also, if you like, the headings of the project of ecological urbanism, because ecological urbanism, we didn't want it to be seen as this is the style of making future cities, but that this is really part of a certain process, mode of thinking, and a sensibility. In the context of cities, we have place for the production of salt, but we see that these spaces are, in a way, almost as if they're part of some kind of a land art project. It is both a functional space, but it actually has an aesthetic dimension to it. And so one of the things that for me was important really was this relationship between functionality and an aesthetic consequence, or something that has a practical dimension, but at the same time, in addition to its practicality, could perform another function as well. This we saw also not just in terms of the role of the external, but also really the internal space. We now have in architecture, in design, certain spaces that are now becoming so large, like the cities that are becoming so large, that these places are really more like internal landscapes. We can talk about the landscape of the interior because it's almost like in this kind of place, as opposed to the other one, where the seaside, the beach, was part of an external territory. Now, really, the beach or the landscape is part of the internal domain, but it's actually part of a very technological condition. So the way in which we are also facing this situation in our cities is not something that we're used to. We're also facing very different, very distinct, very uneven sort of situations and conditions. And as designers, as architects, as landscape architects, planners, we have to be prepared and ready to address the multiplicity of these kinds of conditions. But one of the things that is really critical today, and we understand in terms of our cities, is this issue of waste, in the sense that we can say that the waste of our culture is a reflection of the kind of life that we have. How we, the manner in which we produce waste is very much a sort of reflection of a society. So if you walk down, let's say, parts of 6th Avenue in New York, and you see one fast food place next to another fast food place, next to another fast food place, and so on and so forth, these are also the places that are producing a particular relationship to consumption. So this is part of an infrastructural question of our cities, because we also have to deal, let's say, with this issue. And as I said before, you then realize that in 1 hour, a city like New York can produce the equivalent of something that is, the same size as the Statue of Liberty in terms of waste. So this issue of how we address the question of infrastructure in a different way, from waste to resource management, becomes part and parcel of both a sort of technical, functional aspect of our cities, but also something that potentially can be beneficial as part of the way in which we are reframing, reimagining our cities. So here is the case of, for example, Manhattan having to bring so much salt to the city to deal with snow removal, and the possibility that we can use the concept of snow removal through the use of salt as a project that itself involves certain processes, and that these processes can now also produce some kind of public space or some kind of aesthetic consequence. So this is a project that was done by one of the students a long time ago when I was at Cornell, where this question of where does the salt come from turns into a whole understanding of the economics of that, the delivery systems, and so on and so forth, and in a way becomes the basis for creating an ecology and an economy, linking it to also a space of pleasure, a kind of space of spectacle. Basically, for example, that a park can come out of the whole process of reorganization and removal. The question of infrastructure also operates at a very different level. This is like with the snow and with waste, it's always at the big scale. We also have the examples of things that can happen at much smaller scale. So this is the work that's done by a Japanese firm called Atelier Bawa, where they take, for example, some elements that come, the street food idea, which is also something that's very present in India, and really turning the whole idea of how you are selling street food into an element of public space or a public spectacle, where, for example, you could imagine that certain things that are informal can also be provided with a kind of basic framework that then fits into a kind of semi-formal space that then becomes part of an urban space in terms of the way that they are designing. In other words, what I'm trying to do is to suggest that the idea of thinking about cities doesn't need to happen always at the mega scale of the master plan, though we need that in a context somewhere like India, more planning, more intervention in terms of overall organization. In other words, how do we create new forms of public space? In this case, for example, taking the food carts, creating a new kind of space. This idea of the smaller scale, of the way in which we are also thinking about the spaces of our cities is also reflected in some of the architecture that you find in places like Japan, where in many parts of the world, we've seen a move towards the expansion of residential space. In the States, we have many of these examples of what we are calling McMansions. You know, the footprint for each family house is growing. It's becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. But in some places, like in Japan, you also have people who are really experimenting and exploring the idea of working with tighter space. In the old days in architecture, there was a concept called minimum existence or existence minimum, where this became too much like a functionalist idea. But actually, there is something to be said about the notion of when is something enough? When is it that we have enough to live on? This concept of what is enough is also a value system. It's something that we can collectively decide. It's part of our aspiration, because otherwise, if we're not thinking about that, the whole idea is that we should have more and more and more and more and more. And it's not to I have and you don't have, but we have to have some value in terms of when there will be some level of what is sufficient, what will be sufficient for us. And this sufficiency doesn't mean that it has to be somehow basic, but that it's really constructed in ways where the quality of things can also be transformed. And we have, in a way, in this kind of project, this is what we call a section of a building. You understand that this building is trying to create new forms of relations between spaces of living, spaces of dining, and so on. Because of the way that design enters this idea, design is dealing with the project, actually produces new set of relations where you can produce more value, better quality through the design, through the imagination of the designer. They can go from outside to inside, from inside to outside. A number of architects recently have been addressing this question of the interior, the inside. This is the Mercedes-Benz building done by UN Studio. So I want to emphasize this reciprocity between the interior and the outside. So whenever we are designing cities, we should be thinking as much about the interiority, the outside. So in a sense, ecological urbanism is also a project that has something to do with this concept of the sensibilities or the responses that we have through our bodies with the spaces that surround us. And this is something that, this is, for example, a project by the British artist Anthony Gormley. It's really a project that is also trying to emphasize the idea of the thermal. It's not a place that you go to see, but it's a place that you are lost in, but actually through the environment of this place, you become much more aware of the wetness of the space, of the humidity of the place, and so on and so forth. Ecological urbanism is also part of a certain set of other ideas that at times might seem unrelated. So for example, we did an issue of Harvard Design Magazine called What About the Inside? And this What About the Inside was really looking at the way in which we reconsider the whole phenomenon of interiority or of the interior in terms of architecture and the city. And again, this also touches on the question of ecological urbanism being something that operates at multiple scales. It's not only at the scale of the city, it's actually at the scale of individual sort of participation. The work of a Japanese architect called Shinohara, that how careful they were about the kind of performance of the house and the quality of the spaces, the furniture, the colorations, the materials, the tonality of these things. So this is also for me part of this expression of the kind of sensibilities that in a way go with the design of our buildings and the design of our cities. There is an amazing Japanese filmmaker who is passed away now, called Yoshijiro Ozu. And Ozu made some amazing films, but these are some of the drawings that he made for one of his films. And the reason I'm showing you here is that in these drawings, the role of the figure becomes critical, because instead of just seeing architecture as a form, as something that's looked at, actually it's seen as a relational condition. It's the figure that exists in relation to various ways of using the house. And in cinema, you have often very, very interesting ways in which you look at this concept of close-up and really the relationality between the body and space. For me, the question of this sort of, if we can call it the performativity or the performance of architecture and the city, becomes absolutely intermeshed, involved with the body, with the user, with the person who is part of the city. Therefore, it has a certain strong level of subjectivity. These things are not separated completely and seen as artifacts. Sustainable urbanism as a thing by itself, but really sustainability in terms of architecture and the city is something that is participated in, it's lived, it's situated in a certain way. So in that way, it also is very much a cultural condition. For people who understand sustainable architecture, they also know that in certain cultures, actually our body's tolerance of heat is quite phenomenal. These are other examples of how this appears in photography, where these are actually stage settings of the value or importance that the interior has and the park. And this is really reiterating that, again, with other examples of another house here is by an architect called Su Fujimoto, where this question of the organization of the inside, because it's important to show you specific things that demonstrate the value of limits, the value of not having everything, of actually having certain definition, of knowing that there is some limit of what is available to you in terms of land, in terms of site, in terms of resources. And it is really your responsibility, it's our responsibility to innovate in the most sort of imaginative ways, precisely with given limitations of resources. Therefore, this is why it becomes part of the project of ecological urbanism to really think through that concept of what we do in design or in architecture when we are thinking about limits. So Junya Ishigami, where the structure of the building reaches such a point of thinness that you don't have the idea of main columns and really just columns and space, but that you reduce the size of the columns to the point where you create a field of columns, and therefore there is an attempt to almost make the structure disappear. But you end up with more structure that is disappearing. But this also helps with the way in which you are bringing the outside to the inside, and you're getting a kind of fusion of natural conditions and natural resources on the interior of the building. This project that he did, in a way, is a kind of hybrid of outside and inside, which is quite an interesting thing in terms of the way in which we are sort of rethinking that relationship. This is the Rolex Center by Sana in Lausanne, which again is sort of important in terms of how this idea of the landscape of the interior changes, or in the case of the Tama Art Library by Toyo Ito. So I try to use a group of architects whose work has some kind of affiliation or some sort of sensibility that may be easier for us to actually understand their potential relationship in terms of how you can use architecture to be inventive and innovative through limits. Here is a housing project, it's social housing. It's done in the 70s, and it's done outside of Paris, in the south of Paris, in an area which is really a kind of socialist suburb of Paris called Ivry. And it was done by a French architect called Jean Renaudy. Jean Renaudy wanted to provide, in the context of social housing, the possibility of maximum outdoor space for each one of the apartments, each one of the condominiums, flats. You see, he had also the fact that he was going to use the limit of architecture to maximize the question of public space, for example, for the citizens of this social housing. And therefore, it becomes quite important how you are using this as a way to create this incredible diversity of outdoor spaces. So in some ways, you could say, okay, part of this, of designing with these kinds of limits, is a way to think about the sensibility. But it's also important today not to assume that everything that we're doing is only in the realm of the physical. Because we have to also ask the question, how is the design of our cities, how is the formation of our cities actually affected by situations, in this case technology, in many ways virtual, but the correspondence or the relationship between the virtual and the physical becomes something that we can also use as a system of design. When we did the Ecological Urbanism exhibition, we also commissioned an engineer slash artist called Chuck Hoberman, who teaches at the GSD, to design a kind of responsive facade. This is the idea for the skin of a building that is responding to the sunlight. But actually, the facade itself becomes transformed according to the condition of sunlight. So it actually, brings, in a sense, an element of natural resources and uses that as part of the way that the building gets affected. A lot of you know that also architects have been really struggling for a long time to bring the question of nature and also food production into the city and into architecture. But this is an example of a drawing, of a design that is trying to bring basically some of those aspects into the city so that the city in some ways becomes more self-sufficient, that you're able to in some ways localize resources. Other sort of versions of these aspects of specific buildings had to do with us trying to really transform many existing cities by, for example, having this soft city project that looks at the roofs of buildings and how you can produce solar energy by really creating a kind of soft canvas that could be literally thrown on the roof of buildings as opposed to solar panels and things like this. All of this with the intention of really understanding the question of many of our existing cities. In many cities, I know from our experience in Mumbai and in other cities, you're dealing also with the question of post-industrial conditions. Industry has existed. How do we transform those? How do we deal with urban regeneration? So it's not all to do with new building. It's also to do with the conditions that have existed or the resources that might be available. So, for example, the use of algae as a source of energy becomes part and parcel of things that are given in different conditions. So we're experimenting with really literally building buildings where the facade of building becomes the source of energy for the building itself. But also we have situations where there are artists such as this person, Patrick Blanc, exploring the concept of green facade, but in a very aesthetic way, not so functional in the sense that Arab were using this thing. So this still raises this interplay between the city, the notion of an aesthetic project, and the idea of the functionality of buildings at the same time. And some of you have seen these drawings that Anu Madhur and Dilip Dakuna have done, looking at Mumbai and looking at the floods and really the monsoon, how you try to create a sort of, through mapping, certain conditions where you are in a way more at one with nature. So this series of images are intended to really give us a sense of the way in which we actually use existing conditions. We don't bring something always from outside and apply it as a master plan, but we really transform some of these existing conditions. Another category that we had in the ecological urbanism, and this is obviously an area that is absolutely critical in the case of India, is the whole question of transportation, mobility, and the infrastructural network. And in many parts of the world, public transportation has been used in a very successful way to really create not only a sort of good system of communication for the citizens, but also to try and use those in ways that are sustainable. But others, we worked with the late Bill Mitchell, who passed away a few years ago, recognizing that in some cultures, some societies, we're still going to have to rely on the car, on the automobile. Bill and others were working on the way in which we could still recognize the necessity of the automobile, but maybe it can be redesigned, maybe it can be shrunk in size, which I guess something that has been thought about here in India, but really in this case, a much more sort of sustainable way, that these would be cars that actually plug into their electric cars. They would be plugging into buildings, the roof of the buildings would become transformed. And so you actually create an infrastructure within the city for responding to even the cars that now are very much polluters of the cities. A component of our work has also to do with the fact that we realize that as cities have been developing and growing, the distinction as it used to exist between city and countryside or city and suburb has disappeared. So some of our colleagues, this is the work of Richard Foreman, who is an ecologist in landscape architecture, refer to this concept of urban regions, to use the phenomenon of urban regions to really think about a sort of territory that goes beyond the city, but nevertheless is important in terms of understanding the tension between various cities defined by the red area and really their outlying regions. So you see each one of these cities that has been documented, what is the correlation between the city and the region. This is particularly important in the context of American cities, because in American cities, we have very different political structure for the city versus the region, the city and what is outside the city. Many cities, let's say like Detroit and others, have suffered enormously from the way in which this disjunction between organizational structures has operated. So one of the things that we need to be really emphasizing or pushing for is also the idea that the city politically and economically must be understood in terms of a much wider, larger territory, not just simply in terms of the politics of the city itself, because it's only through the understanding of this larger sort of impact that we can really address the questions of how we design in a more sustainable or ecological fashion. In terms of addressing future cities, one of the things that has become the extended sort of part of the project of ecological urbanism is the manner in which we realize the significance of the coastal regions and the way in which through global warming and so on, really this way in which we design cities that are close to water are going to become a key part of what we will be thinking about and designing. In India, how cities will evolve around regions where there has been no good transportation so far. We have used this kind of concept to also think about, if you like, a more malleable relationship between the coastal region and the whole built area and the water. So these sections actually demonstrate the need for a new kind of design if you like, in harmony with nature, that can be less about very specific boundaries, but actually understands the way in which water moves. For example, people are designing in a different way with this moving shoreline concept that becomes part and parcel of the urban condition. And this is, in some ways, an important aspect of understanding the infrastructure of the city as a way in which you respond to questions of risk and risk mitigation, but actually use it as a means of being more inventive, more innovative for the way that you are designing. And so these things have consequences in terms of daytime and nighttime and so on. And this basically shows this relationship between urban risk and coastal regions, and really the importance, for example, of new understanding of planning, or the value of how we should pay greater attention to this issue of urbanization in relation to the coastal zones of different parts of the world. And of course, you can see that even the future evolution of those places in India is also mentioned as part of this. As part of this project, we also commissioned a smell artist who basically documented the smells of Mexico City. And these bottles that you see here, it's on the map of Mexico, and each bottle, she has tried to manufacture basically the smell of a different region. So this also goes towards the idea that we experience cities in visual terms, in terms of environmental conditions, but we also experience the city in terms of the smell of the city. There are things that are very non-visual. And so when we do that, there is no one-to-one correlation between, for example, a bad smell and a bad area. That might exist often, but there are also times when you might have unexpected smell in places where this is actually, there's a disjunction. So it's important in a way, because this question of smells, in some ways, it helps to question our value systems in some ways, and allows us to sort of think about things or see things in non-visual terms. Earlier, I was saying that at Harvard, we've actually created a group which is called the Sensory Media Group, and it's really to sort of make sure that people who are working with architecture, landscape architecture, urban planning, and design are not only studying things through visuality, that the non-visual also becomes a component of the way in which we design. So aspects of this are reflected in projects that are trying to deal with both kind of visible and invisible conditions and situations. But there are also people who are taking the idea of the connection to landscape or to agricultural territory in different directions. So these are also parts of projects that have been done many years ago in Italy that really look at this idea of using the organization of the agricultural territory as a way to also think about the organization of parts of the city. This is in some ways relevant because unlike India, where you are building and cities are growing, in parts of the world, cities are shrinking. And so in Detroit, for example, there has been the case where the center of the city is becoming depopulated, the value of properties is decreasing, and so people sometimes are demolishing the buildings in order not to pay real estate tax for those buildings. So you end up with large tracts of land actually becoming available in the middle of different cities. So in some ways, you can have the possibility of an agricultural territory deeply in the middle of the city. And so one of the ways is really to see, when you talk about the expansion of cities, how understanding or learning from the organizational formation of the logic of agricultural territory, you can also design or develop aspects of the city itself. And really to sort of see the organization of the city in ways that are very fluid and mobile. So these are some of the projects that are happening in the school that are trying to work not necessarily on the project of ecological urbanism, but really ways of sort of understanding the making of topography, the making of cities. This is part of a project called Urbanism, where sort of drawing the intensity of the city and architecture results in new kinds of new types of plans, new kinds of formations. And this is something that we have to be open to, how we can make these cities in a different way than we have made in the past. We see also that in terms of working with art and with artists, there is a way in which artists are coming to the city and participating in the making of the city in ways that very much touch on this question of the pleasure of our cities. As I was saying before, this is the work of Olafur Eliasson. He made this temporary waterfall for a short period of time, and suddenly a regular sort of bridge that's very functional becomes transformed and becomes a kind of a very different site in New York. So seeing cities as the site of kind of new experiences becomes an important part of how we think about ecological urbanization. I don't want you to go away thinking that ecological urbanism is always about pure sustainability. It's about always the reduction of resources, but it's also about bringing in a different level of participation or democracy into the city. So this is a work of a group called Play Me, I'm Yours. They go around different cities and they take a piano and they leave the piano in a place and they leave. But people come, and someone who knows how to play the piano, then they start playing the piano, and the piano becomes the means of conversation. Somebody becomes curious, comes and says, "What are you playing?" This starts an event in a way. So the piano, in a way, is a kind of catalyst for new relations in the city. And before I was saying about the question of infrastructure, if you start seeing things like the piano, you can see that I mentioned snow removal. These guys in New York is itself also a kind of performance. So in some ways, the concept of curation, of how we take some of the resources that we have or some of the functions, but we curate them in a different way where we get more value, different kind of value from given functions, actually becomes part of how we use resources in new ways. Sometimes it's very important to think about what the city has also as disused elements of its fabric. Many years ago in Paris, there was a railway line that went on the eastern part of the city. And this railway line was disused, and a group of people tried to created a public park on top of this railway line, which is this area here. So this railway line runs through the city and it's horizontal, but the city of Paris has a topography that it's undulating. And this is called Promenade Plantée. When you move through this promenade, you actually get to be sometimes very close to the apartments of people, seeing directly into the apartments, and sometimes you are in the middle of a park because the topography is changing. But this becomes a way to experience the city in very different ways. And then the experience of this place was also somehow related to the High Line that you have heard of in New York, where the High Line has been redesigned in the past 5-6 years, and it's now also become a really important way to enjoy yourself, to experience Manhattan, but to actually also have a place of refuge. So it's about recycling. It's actually about recycling of urban artifacts as part of making a contribution to the city. In this way, I think a lot of the ideas that we have to think about in the future is really about the way in which we respond to the existing city. It's not just always about the new planning or new city, but really how do we modify or transform our existing cities. And this is something that, of course, has some relevance in terms of what might happen to existing buildings, and their reclamation in terms of resources and green roofs and things like that, which is very, very obvious. Sometimes it has to be something very different. This is another group that are involved with us at Harvard and teach in the planning program, a group called Ecosistema Urbana, where they really take this concept of urban filters. This is a structure that has lots of plants in it. So in a way, it's both a new kind of lightweight monument, but at the same time, it's an air cleansing element that, together with kind of public park and benches and seats like that, becomes a new element in the city, so that the concept of a public space can also be thought of in many, many ways. We have many options for how we think about the future of public space. This is really to talk about how these ideas then enter cultures and societies where we're not designing in a way like Europe. So in Africa, what would be the consequence of this kind of a form of planning which is very much not top-down but bottom-up? And what can we learn from those kinds of conditions so that we can also introduce those ideas into our project? And this is the work of an artist who really tried to use this connection to agricultural territory in a way to make a new kind of art project. So I'm just going to give you some of these examples of what is happening after this project of ecological urbanism. That's where we ended with this idea of the connection between the sort of ethical and aesthetic, the idea that ecological urbanism was really also trying to make an argument as a political project, that we really need to think about cities differently. Since then, we've gone on and we've just published recently this book called In the Life of Cities, which is part of 3 projects. In a way, when we think about the city, we also have to think about, if you like, the narrative of the city, the story of the city, and how that works. So going back to the work of the Japanese architect, Japanese filmmaker that I mentioned, I'm actually very interested in some of these things that might exist in contemporary American TV. For example, you might know this TV series called The Sopranos. I don't know if you have seen it, but this is about the mafia in New York, and it's about there in New Jersey, and these are the scenes from the beginning of the film when somebody is going from New York to New Jersey. How these things are relevant in terms of how we think about the relationship to these industrial sites that are next to our cities. Basically, my point is that if you are going to make cities in the future, you also have to think about the story of the kind of life that will be lived in those cities. So the next step, in a way, after ecological urbanism is also to think about the kind of city that we want to make. And the way that we think about the kind of city is to think about the kind of life that we want to have in this thing. Longer, but there is a story about all of these things, which then links us really to the whole relationship between the city, inside, outside, about the role of informal communities, and maybe we can discuss these before, the connection of our cities to political space and the spaces of participation. And it's because I would like to bring all of these themes somehow as part of something that is still linked to ecological urbanism, that it's a political project, and how we've been connecting these things to some of the studios at Harvard, for example, people working in Sao Paulo and in other informal communities, the kind of projects that come out of those that might have some relevance. Some of the work that Rahul has been doing under the rubric of extreme urbanism that we might discuss, and the link between these things and really the kind of intellectual project, the publications. In the next phase, we would actually think more about this question of the politics of the city. This is Cardiff in the UK, and really a kind of typical Saturday night in Cardiff. The question of the organization of life, but really this is more about the sort of the political dimension, becomes interesting in the next phase. I will show you some of these examples of how we've been documenting different cities. This is Chicago. This is Hong Kong. What kind of life is this in terms of, so this is when we're going from the ecological to the sort of the politics and the ethics of urbanization. Life in Tokyo and the subway system, what it was like in New York, in Soho, and really the relationship between the city and the architecture of the city. And then these are some examples of work that's been shown or people who've been teaching. So I wanted to really link the architecture of our projects to this bigger project of urbanization. So I'll just show you some of this material. The reason I'm showing you these is to say that with ecological urbanism, we are introducing, in a way, the notion of a certain kind of social project. And I want to make sure that we understand that this social project is also still very much related to advancements that we want to make in terms of architecture, in terms of various disciplines. These lead to really where we are now, which is this question of how do we, as institutions, this book that we made to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the design school, which is called Instigations, it's really about the role of institutions and how institutions have the responsibility to initiate, to instigate new projects that are really not only about the transformation of their own practices, but they make a contribution to society. So in part, what we're interested in terms of conversations with you is really how can academic institutions create the basis for new affiliations, new collaborations that are highly site-specific. They really focus on particular conditions, and at the same time, they don't come with standard solutions. They understand the specificity of these locations and use those to propose new insights and actually learn from those places. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.